Right, so if peace suddenly breaks out in the Middle East and no one believes it, did it really happen? That's the paradox, if you like, that Israel and the United States have tried to feed us with their abrupt announcement of a ceasefire between Israel and Iran. One so sudden, so suspiciously timed, and so utterly uncoordinated that it almost fell apart before it began. Trump announced it. Netanyahu smirked through it, you might imagine. Iran, they didn't have a scooby about it. They had no idea. They hadn't been consulted. They thought, fine, okay, we'll go along with this, but perhaps wondering if this is a false flag they can smell or whether the dog had done something dirty on the Persian rug. And within hours, jets were back in the air, weren't they? Accusations were flying again, and the entire charade seemingly collapsed like a house of cards in a sandstorm. That said, matters calmed down as Trump seemingly tugged Israel's leash again, though. This is a ceasefire hurriedly formed without agreement, trust, or sincerity, so is it really a truce or is it just more theatre, more performance? Netanyahu has been performing this exact routine for years, using ceasefires in Gaza as a for instance, not as stepping stones towards peace, but as political props to dodge scrutiny and flip blame. Now the same playbook is being dusted off for Iran, complete with a media chorus, Western condemnation, and a conveniently timed ceasefire that seemingly came with a false flag twist. What follows may, instead of being a diplomatic breakthrough, may end up being a carefully choreographed charade designed simply to manipulate headlines, to take control of and manipulate the narrative, justify further aggression later, and rebrand the instigator of all of this, Israel, as the victim. But if this latest peace effort feels fake, performative, and vaguely familiar, because it is. Welcome to Act 2 of Netanyahu's wartime theatre with regards to Iran. We've seen his commitment to ceasefires before, so what makes this one any different? Right, so last night, our time, the world began blinking in, well, disbelief, frankly, scratching our heads as a ceasefire all of a sudden was apparently declared between Israel and Iran, heralded by Donald Trump as a conclusion of what he's called a 12-day war. This sudden announcement seemed on its surface like, well, certainly welcome de-escalation. It was getting very concerning. Though for those of us who've been observing Gaza for the last 20 months, also the ceasefire in Lebanon as it happens, and seen Israel violate them with impunity, hundreds of times over in fact, we might be looking at this rather jadedly. But within mere hours of it supposedly coming into effect, it looked like our fears might have been ratified rather faster than we thought. The so-called truce apparently shattered. Jets were back in the air on their way to bomb Iran again. Accusations mounted and the mask of diplomacy fell away to reveal that rather familiar play by Israel, raising suspicions about what this really was. Not peace, but performance. A false flag, another act in Israel's long-running playbook of narrative control and strategic military deceit. If this was diplomacy, it was diplomacy by coercion and dishonesty and manipulation. And at the centre, as ever, was standing Benjamin Netanyahu. To understand how this ceasefire almost collapsed as quickly as it began, let's start by looking at how this ceasefire came into being, because it wasn't through the usual negotiation or mutual agreements that typically herald a ceasefire, because there was none of that, but through unilateral declaration by the same powers that initiated the war, saying, basically, we've had enough, we've decided we're going to stop now. Israel started this with US help, then they suddenly decided to stop. It's not very in keeping with typical Israeli action, is it? According to multiple reports, though, Iran had not even been party to the ceasefire's design. Tehran had reportedly received no plan, no draft, no diplomatic overture, just a sudden declaration that peace had been achieved. Iran, always stating that its condition for halting retaliation was the cessation of Israeli and US aggression, did in fact stop its fire when Trump's 7 a.m. ceasefire time rolled around. They actually stopped firing some hours earlier, around 4 a.m., but as we now know, Israel did not. This episode bears all the hallmarks of what Netanyahu perfected during Israel's long-standing assaults on Gaza. Escalate violence until global pressure builds, then call for or agree to a ceasefire at the precise moment it becomes politically beneficial to him. He's running out of ammo, pressure to get some of the hostages home gets too much, that kind of thing. In Gaza, this tactic was employed repeatedly. Israel would launch brutal attacks, flattening neighborhoods, hospitals, schools. And as international scrutiny intensified, Netanyahu would agree to a ceasefire. Ceasefires were called not to save lives, but to save face. And just as quickly as they were declared, they got broken, often with blame redirected towards Hamas, Palestinians, or anyone except Israel. But unilaterally ending ceasefires in this day and age has not restored Israel's desired victim status as planned. We may now be seeing the same formula being applied to Iran, therefore, launching unprovoked strikes on Iranian nuclear sites and assassinating key scientists, military personnel, and then, of course, as Israel always does, targeting civilian areas. Israel found itself on the receiving end of devastating retaliation, which has gone on for the last 12 days now, and included in that attack by the US as well. Iran's Operation Glad Tidings of Victory, that strike on the US Al Udeid air base in Qatar, marked the turning point. Iran's military having already demonstrated its reach, its precision, and its resolve, and just how easily it was tearing Israel apart. This strike was different. This strike was actually prearranged and forewarned to both Qatar and the US, and all agreed to by all sides, apparently, as a face-saving retaliation on a US target that had been cleared of personnel, completely avoided casualties, but inflicted significant symbolic damage. But it was in the wake of this strike that Trump suddenly announced his ceasefire. How can there be a ceasefire between parties when one never agreed to the terms, and what even are the terms? Tehran officials confirmed that no formal negotiations had occurred. Iran simply held its fire upon hearing that Israel might do the same thing, essentially, stating if they stop firing, we will as well. And Iran had actually always said this, which is probably why Trump figured negotiation wasn't necessarily required to stop this, and stop it quickly. Then within hours, Israel claimed that Iranian missiles had breached the ceasefire, prompting renewed strikes ordered by Israel's mad Defense Minister Israel Katz on Tehran. Iran, for its part, denied any such launch had happened. In fact, the Iranian military stated that Israel had already attacked Iran 3 times since the ceasefire had supposedly began. They'd actually kept attacking Iran until 9 a.m. Thus it all started to then crack up. Israel violates the ceasefire before it starts, then accuses Iran of breaking it to justify further attacks. People were readily screaming, "Here's the false flag attack we've all been expecting." And it's because the pattern is disturbingly familiar that people thought this. As Mehdi Mohammadi, an advisor to Iran's parliamentary speaker, warned, signals of de-escalation, ceasefire, non-retaliation, or anything of the sort coming from Trump or the regime are nothing but deception aimed at surprise and false gestures intended to intensify the conflict. If we are not smart, we will be dealt a heavy blow. Israel's narrative pivots rely on one consistent tactic: claim victimhood whilst initiating aggression. As soon as Iran defends itself, Israel cries foul. This maneuver works best when the Western media echoes all of Israel's talking points, as it too often does, especially when US interests are involved, or a great many other Western nations. The hypocrisy of this ceasefire and the caution that should be exercised with it cannot be overstated enough. Israel, which initiated hostilities, offers Iran peace only after raining bombs on its infrastructure and scientists. The US, completely complicit in these strikes both directly and indirectly, participating in attacks on Iranian nuclear facilities, including using bunker busters and B-2 bombers as they did. So the notion that the aggressors get to dictate the terms of peace here, all without negotiation, all without compensation, all without accountability, is not diplomacy. What we're seeing here is coercion wrapped in a press release. But Iran understand this well. In agreeing to halt fire, Iran hopes to project reasonableness, but also holding firm that any further aggression would be met with proportional response again. Iran's official position was simple: stop firing on us and we will stop firing on you. But we also all know that Netanyahu has very little interest in real peace. For a man who is politically cornered, besieged by corruption trials, and presiding over growing civil unrest at home, war is not a liability to him. It's all that's keeping him in power. As with Gaza, conflict becomes a tool to divert attention from domestic scandals and consolidate support amongst the far right. A ceasefire that appears to make Netanyahu look reasonable, carefully crafted illusion, therefore. It lets him posture as a mature actor on the global stage, as someone who can be negotiated with when the reality is he absolutely can't be. And where he's used ceasefires to lay traps for the likes of Gaza and Lebanon in the past, they may be doing likewise here for Iran. The trap is quite clear, I think. Provoke Iran into breaching a ceasefire Israel never truly committed to, then use that as pretext to potentially resume bombing. And there's a few reasons to think that may be apparent to some of you already, but I'll come back to that in a moment. Within the hour of the truce apparently collapsing, though, Trump took to Truth Social, didn't he? Screamed to Israel not to drop those bombs as the jets were already in the air. Don't wreck the ceasefire. Trump has been damaged heavily at home for wrecking that peacemaker image of his that he'd carefully cultivated and gone into the election on, and he'd quite like that back. And ending matters between Israel and Iran goes a long way towards that in his head. But to his own interests supersede Israel's at the end of the day, and indeed those of his Zionist backers. There's very good reasons to wonder about that. For instance, Trump's prior calls for regime change in Iran just in the last day or so before this ceasefire declaration that he suddenly came up with. Does that reveal the strategic dishonesty of this whole affair, or is this simply Trump's bipolar approach to foreign policy and warfare? If the goal is peace, why deploy the aging USS Nimitz to the region amongst other assets in the last week or so, as we've seen? The Nimitz has been looked at as a potential false flag in the making since we learned of its deployment to the Middle East, given it is due to be decommissioned next year. So was it bait for Iran to strike? Were they going to try and convince Iran to strike this vessel? I don't think they'd fall for that one, particularly myself. Obviously, if a US asset in the area is a US asset in the area, and the US did strike them, and they chose to strike that base in Qatar. But Israel might strike it to create a false flag, potentially. It's a vessel that the US can afford to lose, in theory. Why put the vessel there to leave Israel to do it, though? If Trump is the sort prepared to drop bunker busters on nuclear facilities, is he perhaps the sort of person prepared to engineer an attack on one of his own vessels? Something akin to a Gulf of Tonkin moment to rally American opinion behind a broader war. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, for clarification, was a false flag attack launched by the US against Vietnam, claiming an attack by the Vietnamese on them that in fact never happened, used as a precursor for a further US assault. It was actually a manipulation of intelligence. Now, in this day and age, they might have to put on a more of a show to pull a similar stunt off, with the eyes of the world on everything via social media as it is. Israel's desperation is easy to understand when you see the toll Iran has inflicted, though, and why they might actually want at least a breather, if not a genuine end this time to hostility. Iranian missile strikes have caused over $1.3 billion worth of damage to Israeli military and intelligence infrastructure, civilian infrastructure as well, caught in the crossfire, including successful hits on the likes of Unit 8200's headquarters, Mossad headquarters, and the Ministry for the Interior. This damage is not just financial either, it's psychological, and arguably that's of a higher cost. Iran demonstrated a capacity that Israel underestimated, breaching air defenses and striking high-value targets. The illusion of invincibility surrounding Israel's military has cracked completely, and everyone in Israel now knows it. And yet, rather than own its strategic miscalculation, Israel and its allies may still have chosen a well-worn path here. Blame Iran, shift the narrative, claim victimhood. But this time the world is less easily convinced. When Israel claims that Iran violated the ceasefire, yet fails to provide the evidence that's needed, convincing evidence at that, the credibility gap ends up growing, and all the more so given Israel's long track record of breaking ceasefires itself. It is also simply not in desperate Benjamin Netanyahu's interest to end a war after 12 days that he's wanted for 30 years. The destruction of Iran's nuclear capabilities ended when actually there's zero proof they've actually achieved that, despite Israel claiming they've achieved all their goals. He also needs war to stay in power, as I've said already. Ending war isn't conducive to that. However, the scale of damage on Israel has been huge, so perhaps in the grand scheme of things, in this case, he is backing off. It's very hard to take anyone's word on such things at face value, though, especially when it comes to the US and Israel. It'll be in the days and the weeks to come that it'll be put to test to see if it holds. As if to further complicate the picture all the more, though, another possible false flag operation of reports on strikes on radar systems in Iraq, the Balad Air Base, Camp Taji, and the Imam Ali Air Base. These facilities had the ability to monitor fighter jet activity. The attacks may be being preemptive and surgical, and certainly would benefit Iran, you would think, indicating a wider strategy of disabling regional detection systems to allow unmonitored Israeli operations. At the time of writing, nobody's actually claimed responsibility for those strikes at all, so was that Israel or somebody else entirely? What Israel and the US are practicing here is not diplomacy. It's a form of weaponized negotiation where optics matter more than outcomes and power overrides the process. This is not about peace, it's about PR now. A ceasefire used to deflect blame, reframe aggression, and entrap the enemy into looking like the perpetrator is not a truce, it's a trap. If Israel had been winning, they'd still be going, wouldn't they? Who doesn't believe that? If diplomacy is to mean anything again, it's got to be redefined around principles of accountability, sincerity, and mutual respect. Israel cannot be allowed to continue manipulating narratives like it has a long track record of doing, with the tacit approval of allies and a media who echo its script. If the global community wants to see peace, then all this performative politics has to end, and real consequences need to follow for those who instigate such strikes or seek to sabotage diplomacy and peace. Iran, for all of its flaws, did not start this war. It was struck first. It gave advance warning of its retaliation. It halted fire when told a ceasefire was beginning. To give it a chance. So they still look like the grown-ups here. And still it was blamed for ending the very ceasefire it never agreed to in the first place, almost derailing it before it ever begun. That's not diplomacy, that's deceit. Should the current ceasefire collapse once more, it will be the inevitable outcome of a strategy rooted in manipulation, coercion, and calculated falsehoods that we've seen Israel do time and again before. Netanyahu's government, in desperation to regain narrative control, will turn to the same tactic it perfected over Gaza, which is to escalate and deceive, and then cry victim afterward. Trump will support them if they can manage to do this convincingly, of that I'm certain. He'll want appropriate diplomatic cover next time, I'm sure. Given how badly Israel has been hurt in this conflict, this time could genuinely be different, though. But who's going to take their word for it? Israel and Trump deserve no plaudits for performative peace, however. Israel are back to raising Gaza. They're back to attacks in the West Bank. They are still as depraved as ever, but are back to punching down on those that can't fight back. Their favourite sort of opponent. And accountability for that still seems far beyond reach. Yesterday, Netanyahu looked trapped by this war he'd started. He might be off the hook for it for now. Bit, anyway. But whether matters stay that way is largely going to be down to him. Get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, sort of spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated, holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.